This video is supported by Bootstrap Farmer. Hey there, welcome to Geeky Greenhouse. In today's video, I'll go over 5 common seed starting mistakes that beginners make. Starting your seeds is step 1 to a successful garden, and over the 10 plus years of gardening that we have under our belts, we have made all of these mistakes, so I wanted to share them back with you so that you can avoid them. So I'll go through these 5 mistakes, and then at the end of the video, I'll also do a quick crash course on how to properly start seeds. So the first seed starting mistake is planting your seeds too early or too late. This can drastically impact your overall yield and the potential that your plants will have to actually produce a harvest. A good example of planting too early would be planting your watermelons before the soil outdoors has warmed up. Watermelons, cantaloupes, and cucumbers, they all really like warm temperatures, and if you get them outside too early, the plants may become stunted or otherwise damaged from the cold temperatures. On the other side of things, it's common to plant broccoli and cauliflower and kale and other brassicas a little bit too late, especially in colder climates, because these plants don't like warm temperatures very much. So it's very important to start your broccoli early enough so that it has enough time to mature during the cool season. I will say the more likely mistake to be made is planting too early, and I'll use peppers as an example just because we've been growing them for so long. It's very common for growers to start weeks too early when growing peppers, and what happens is the plants will begin to mature in their smaller containers, beginning to flower and go to fruiting far too early. This is not what you want. You want to get your plants outside as soon as they've outgrown their smaller containers, so planting at the right time and not too early is very important. Now, knowing exactly when to plant is an entirely different video. I'm not going to go through all of the different planting times for each climate, for each crop. It's definitely a complicated process, but my recommendation is to do your own planning around the crops that you'll be growing. Spending a little bit of time in your first gardening season to figure out when to plant all of the crops that you like to grow is going to be an invaluable resource for yourself for years to come. So whether you prefer to write things down or maybe use a Google Sheet to document when you're planting each of your crops in your gardening zone will be a very useful tool for you going forward, and you can adjust as needed in subsequent growing seasons. So if you found that planting your peppers in late March was a little bit too late and your plants weren't large enough when it was time to transplant, you could plant a couple weeks earlier in the following year and adjust your documentation. The next seed starting mistake is planting too deep or too shallow. In other words, you really should know exactly how deep to plant your seeds. For example, thyme seeds are very, very small. They're almost microscopic, and they're best surface sown right on the surface of the soil without burying them. Other seeds like these turnips or tomato seeds, or especially when you get into larger seeds like peas or string beans, you definitely want to go a lot deeper into the soil. So my general rule of thumb is to plant your seeds about twice as deep as the seeds are wide. Pepper and tomato seeds, for example, are a couple of millimeters wide, so you'll want to plant about 1/4 inch below the surface of the soil and no deeper. For larger seeds like peas and cucumbers, you can go about 1/2 inch below the surface and the plants will have no problem emerging above the soil. The only exception is that some crops require light to germinate. Not all of them, but make sure you check your seed packet to see if that's the case, in which case, even if the seed is a bit larger, you want to make sure that you don't bury it underneath the soil so that it gets some light exposure to germinate. The next seed starting mistake is not planting directly in the ground when you should. Root vegetables like carrots and beets and parsnips, turnips, and also things like cucumbers and watermelons don't really like being transplanted. So if you start these plants indoors and then try to transplant them outside, you may end up with some very wacky looking carrots that are kind of hard to eat. It's much better to wait until the conditions are right outside and direct sow your seeds outside in the garden. That way your seedlings are never being moved around, they're never being disturbed, and they're starting and ending in the same location. So look for words like direct seed or direct sow on your seed packet to know when that's the case. The next mistake is a very big one, and we've made it a few times ourselves, and that is allowing your seeds to dry out when they're germinating. All seeds, as far as I know, require water in order to germinate. It's one of the factors that initiates germination along with temperature. And once your seeds are planted, you want to make sure that they never dry out before germinating. That's why it's so important to have a spray bottle with some water nearby your germination station so that you can check daily to see if any of your seed cells are drying out and give them a spritz of water whenever needed. That's also the entire purpose of something like a humidity dome like this here, to sit over your trays of planted seeds and trap the moisture inside, keeping it nice and humid in there to avoid the soil drying out. And another seed starting mistake is not considering the temperature that each seed variety prefers for germination. Cool weather crops like lettuce and brassicas all prefer cooler soil temperatures for germination compared to warmer season crops like watermelons or peppers and tomatoes, which like it a lot warmer. So we use a seed starter mat for any warm season crops that are being started indoors, like our peppers and tomatoes and other nightshades. This allows us to keep the soil temperature up around 80 or 85 degrees Fahrenheit, which is much warmer than it normally is in our house. And then for cooler weather crops, we don't use a seed heating mat and keep the temperature around room temp. Now I want to give a quick crash course on how we start our seeds, basically our blueprint for successfully sowing seeds indoors every time. The first thing I always recommend is getting some nice high quality seed starting supplies like these trays from Bootstrap Farmer. We've been using Bootstrap Farmer products for years now, and they just last and last and last. And that's definitely something we value as gardeners for many years. So if you're starting a relatively small number of plants, maybe you just need some 6-cell trays like these ones. Or if you're starting more plants, maybe these 72-cell air prune trays, which are great for things like onions, or if you have a particularly large garden, you can sow a lot of plants in a relatively small space. You'll also need a humidity dome of some kind. You don't necessarily need to use a proper humidity dome like this one, although it is a lot more convenient. You could just use some plastic wrap to cover up the soil after your seeds are planted, or maybe a plastic tray lid that you have from some leftover food containers. You'll also need some soil, of course. We use some regular potting mix for most of our seeds. You can also use seed starter mix, which is really light and fluffy with finer particles, and that's really great for smaller seeds. So maybe if you're planting thyme or you're planting lettuces, anything with a smaller seed size, that seed starter mix comes in handy. A spray bottle with some water is going to be invaluable for planting your seeds. Again, you never want to let your seeds dry out, so spritzing them regularly is critical. And lastly, if you're planting more than just a few different types of plants, it's always best to stay organized. So I highly recommend you use a Sharpie and some plant tags, or maybe some tape like we're using here, to keep track of what's being planted. And lastly, of course, are your seeds. I'll be planting some peppers and tomatoes. It's pretty early in the season for us right now. And with your supplies in hand, the process is really simple and quick. Start by filling up your trays with pre-moistened potting mix. Make sure you really pre-moisten the soil, mix it thoroughly with some water until it has the moisture content of a wrung out sponge. Then fill each of your containers with soil, tamping it down gently as you go until you reach about a 1/4 inch from the surface. Now is a great time to label your seed cells with whatever it is you're planting. I also like to add the planting date so that I can keep track of how long it takes each seed to germinate. With all your pots filled, use the back end of a pen or a pencil tip to create a small hole in the center of each pot. Drop in at least 2 seeds of each variety. I like to do at least 2 to make sure that at least one of them germinates, and then cover with the surrounding soil. Again, make sure you're planting at the right depth. For example, these thyme seeds are surface sown. I just dropped a few on the surface of the soil and tamped it down gently with my finger. Next, spray the surface of the soil to make sure that the seeds are nice and moist. Then cover the trays with a humidity dome or something similar to trap that moisture, and set them in a location with the right temperature. For our pepper and tomato seeds, we're gonna have them on a seed heating mat set to 80 degrees Fahrenheit, so the soil will be nice and warm for those seeds to germinate fast. But if you're planting lettuce, for example, you'll wanna get those into a nice sunny window, and temperature doesn't quite matter as much. Over the coming days, make sure you check in at least once a day, pull off the humidity dome, and check for any dry spots, spraying the surface of the soil as needed. After a few days, you should start to see your first seedlings emerging, and if you see any duplicate plants like these tomatoes here, you can thin them down at this point so there's 1 plant per container. There are many other mistakes that we have made as well, such as planting seeds that are too old or planting too many of a certain type of plant. What other mistakes have you made that you would like to help others avoid? Leave a comment down below with your biggest mistakes when it comes to seed starting. Thanks for watching Geeky Greenhouse, and I'll see you next time.